Victor, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time and for being here, man. And huge shout out to our girl Price, because I don't know if you and I would have gotten connected had it not been for her. She is an absolute legend, one of my favorite people to talk to. For people who don't know you, maybe as well as Price might, would you mind filling in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing stuff you're doing in that soccer space down there at Florida now?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Dan. My name is Victor Hoffman. I'm the director of applied performance at the University of Florida. I've been in this role for about 6 months now. Previous to that, I was a strength and conditioning coach working primarily with women's soccer and golfs at Mississippi State University. And before that, I was at the University of Memphis working with a variety of teams in the strength and conditioning space. I've spent a lot of, probably the last decade of my career in the strength and conditioning space, started in that role. And then all the way up until here, where now I'm primarily in a sports science role and analytics. So it's, a different change of pace, but, there's been a lot of learning and a lot of great things that I've been able to balance the two sides of that with going forward here at Florida.
I'd love to have you dive into that a little bit more, Victor, because as we are just talking, you're in a very unique role, but it's a role that I'm seeing pop up across sport more and more frequently now, it seems, is they're not just putting every single thing under the sun on the strength coach, right? You're not programming for the team, traveling with the team, doing the entire sports science side and then some. There's almost like a little division effect occurring where now positions are opening up with teams to literally do the sports science testing element, but also maybe bridge that gap a little bit more from lab setting to maybe more practical sports setting, if you will.
So I'll kind of take you, even further back to where it really started for me at Memphis. In Memphis, I've been working with soccer since 2020. I got to Memphis in 2019, working with a variety of sports, but, honestly, there didn't rely much on technology, in soccer, right? No GPS units, no force frames, things like that. We had jump mats, Brower gates, really basic things, what feels like nowadays, but no real load monitoring technology that we worked with, right? So everything that we did from a programming, from a periodization standpoint, was solely based off structure of training, RPE, what we were seeing in the weight room, coach's eye. We had a very consistent structure of what we did in the weight room, which really, really helped. I did some load monitoring on my end, whether it was session RPEs, built out the Excel with acute to chronic and all that stuff based on the RPEs alone. But really didn't really get my fair share of sports science until I got to Mississippi State, where I was working a little bit more heavily with soccer. Got introduced to stat sports, things like that. And then it was just really interesting to me, I think, going from a role where I had no load monitoring technology into a role where I did, because so much of it was looking at, okay, if we set up our training structure similar here at Mississippi State as we did at, Memphis, what does that data actually give us? What do the numbers look like, rather than if I would have started with the numbers and just started chasing numbers, it could have kind of skewed my perspective going into it. But really, when I got to Mississippi State, I was like, this technology is awesome. Let's try to see what the structure we already kind of had going in my previous role, what that looks like data wise, and then we'll make adjustments from there. So then we were able to really just see, okay, what does a week look like in the structure? What does, the progression look like week to week? And really, when I got started with sports science, that's where a lot of my focus went, was, okay, this is what happened this week. Let's see what the progression does last week. Oh, was that too much? Was that too little? All right, we scale this way, we adjust this. And that's really where it started, and all the way to the point where, you learn those little things over time. And then, by the end of it, you're a primary voice in practice design, right? In terms of what types of games, what types of, just structure, time overall, it really evolved into. But it never really came first from, what are the numbers telling us? It really came from, what does our structure look like? And then let the numbers kind of support and drive what we're doing in that regard, if that
As
answers
you
your
mentioned,
question.
I think having that structural component to it is so essential. A lot of times, I feel like people go about this sports science element, or in this case, more of a load monitoring specific one, and they don't really have a framework that they're working off of, or more importantly to me, they don't know what questions they're trying to answer. And instead of actually going at it systematically, which don't get me wrong, there's issues with every system, no system accounts for everything. But if we go in without a question or knowing what we're looking for, we just get sheets and sheets of data, right? There was a lab I referenced when we were talking off mic a little bit ago, and on average per hour, that lab produces 20 terabytes of data. Do you know how much like numbers and stuff that is to try and sort through and sift
Right.
through? I mean, my iPhone that has thousands and thousands of pictures and videos on it isn't even half a terabyte of data. Like just the amount of numbers you collect when you start doing GPS, now multiply that out by an entire team. It's unbelievable how much it can be. So, how did you go into this new to the whole load monitoring conversation and say to yourself, you know what, these are the questions we as a staff, we as a team are trying to answer, and this is the process that I'm going to implement to try and do that?
I mean, I honestly just came in and applied a strength and conditioning focus, principles to it right away, right? Because, to me, the high speed running, the max XLs, max D cells, all that was still so new. So part of me was like, okay, if, this program is already looking at total distance, high intensity run or high speed running, max speeds, things like that, let me put that into strength and conditioning terms. Okay, so distance is going to be volume, high speed running is going to be intensity, volume of acceleration to decelerations is going to be a volume metric. And, if you're looking at the intensity of those XLs, D cells is going to be an intensity metric. So, like I said, we went through 1 week at a time. We watched how those metrics progressed over time. Ideally in the spring, when you look at those things, you're looking at somewhat of a 10% increase in them, right? If you're trying to look at progression and then obviously a deload down the road. But, so if we went through a week in the spring where we didn't have a spring match, but some of those metrics jumped up 25, 30%, we're like, okay, wait. What if okay, because our volume jumped up, maybe we just scale volume back a little bit. If our high speed running was really high, maybe we do something with the intensity, right? Even down to the periodization scheme, because I was in a situation where we were asking how should we, schedule our trainings, and a lot of it was just almost like that high low principle of, if our volume's high this day, it should probably be low the next day. If our intensity's high this day, and it gets really it's more complex in soccer because the high low model is, really beautifully organized and structured, but at the same time, in soccer, you almost look at it from like a specific quality standpoint. So, like from whether it's hamstrings, right? If it's high speed running, your hamstrings are high that day. Bring the field size down the next day. Now they're less load on the hamstrings, right? So, like super simple principles like that is what I tried to apply to it right away. And then just really on top of that, taking extensive notes about what worked and what didn't. So, what observations did we see? Kind of like science, right? Just really noting your observations, doing it, but it wasn't a lot of following a script or following the research and things like that. It was a lot of just kind of being in the weeds and diving head into it.
I love that point that you made in relation to potential hamstring injuries because Evan just talked about this the other week with Aaron that way. The soft tissue injury problem in soccer is rampant, whether you're talking hamstrings, adductors, quad, rec fem type stuff, whatever you're referring to, it is a problem in that
Mhm.
sport. And as you mentioned, if you understand what you're actually measuring, right? Oh, I'm measuring volume. Oh, I'm measuring intensity, whatever it is that you're actually assessing, you can make those recommendations and adjustments accordingly. I love that concept of, hey, look, they had a high total yardage yesterday. I know we need high intensity today. Let's shrink the field. Or one of the other things we used to do way back when I did travel ball, if people were getting tired, we played with a 12th person on the field. Or if they wanted to condition us, we played a person down in our practice and scrimmage and all that sort of thing. And there was 10 of us covering a full pitch, right? All of a sudden that workload probably went way up. We didn't have science or data at the time, just kind of thinking about it rationally that way. So I love those points that you've made in that concept. Taking that a step further, we've got a process in place. We know what we're trying to answer, I guess I'll say. How do you then take that and make it actionable from there? Is there a visualization process that you like to use, whether that's Excel or Power BI or Tableau or whatever that way? Or, where coaches just kind of naturally bought into this and it was like, hey, I don't have to play arts and crafts with my spreadsheets here. I can actually just kind of keep it simple, present it, and go from there.
So for us, the most frequent form of communication that on a reporting standpoint that our coaches get is a 3-page document that has number one, the daily load overall. So pretty much ranks players highest to lowest in those metrics I was talking about. So you can see, okay, and they're also like color coded by position. So you can see, wow, our forwards or our midfielders had really high distance today, but our forwards had the most high speed running on that day alone. So it's just a very quick glimpse that you can see load trend within 5 seconds. The next one is the weekly loads. So you just see which players, it's almost the same structure as page one, but you're looking at all the days combined and you can see which players are leading, right? Super simple stuff. The last page that the coaches look at is the drill breakdown. So it's pretty much every single drill that we did, all of the distance, all the high speed running, the work rate, and that's where you can really start to paint the picture in terms of from like an educational standpoint, right? Because, in sports science, especially if you're working with like periodization, you're working with coaches, the number one thing that you can do is educate them on the structure they use. Because, it's one thing to just say you need to do this, do this, do this when it comes to programming. But if you can really start to influence, if they start to think, okay, hey, small sided games equals less high speed running, less hamstring demand, then they start to naturally do it by themselves a little bit more. So that's where those in-depth drill analysis can be really helpful of painting the picture of like, okay, this was our distance today, but this drill right here shows why it was so high or why it was so low and things like that. So that's where you really start to figure out your foundation because then over time, the coaches are like, hey, remember when we ran that drill 3 weeks ago? What was the load there? I think we were to run that again, right? So like those are the conversations that start to happen that can make it really practical rather than just numbers, numbers, numbers.
I think that's absolutely huge. Taking that a step further, you kind of alluded to the concept of kind of a drill library, if
Mhm.
you will, that way. And that's something I've had several people ask me questions about, and they're like, I don't really know where to start building this. And to me, my mind thinks of just being present at practices, events, that sort of thing, and being able to tag in real time on your GPS, start and stop times from that. And then from there, it just becomes a lot of additional legwork to actually build the library and communicate with support staff and personnel about what drills are called and what they're actually running and that sort of thing. Is there anything else that you recommend to people as they go about building a kind of sports specific drill library from a science and analytics standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it spot on, right? Is the naming of the drills. Like literally that will save you so much, I guess, so many headaches and save you so much time down the road because, you know, 7v7, is it always 7v7 or is it 77 plus one, 77 plus two? Like, is it named, the pep drill today? Like, whatever it is, like, there's just got to be consistency in your naming structure so that, in your first year with GPS, you're collecting a lot. So like you're collecting, collecting, collecting. It's really hard to act on it right away. But if you go look back after a year and you try to go back and analyze what happened, it's really hard if you have the same drill named three different things. So one thing we did within our organization is we looked if we have a specific naming structure. So like when we cut a drill, we know if it's 77, it's going to be 77. If we have a focus for it, it's very intentionally put into the name. That way, when we go back in our drill database, we can find it. We have the dates, things like that. It's just a lot easier to find. So I think that is number one is getting very clear on what your naming structure looks like so that you can start to really build some good data from it over time.
What was your process for kind of breaking down more of the match day specific GPS numbers and metrics that way?
First, it was, what are we seeing right away? Who's the highest? Who's the lowest? Things like that. Because I'll talk about, I'll say this when it comes to match demands, right? Is there's so much research out there that hits on match demands in soccer, and they're awesome from a general perspective. But where research can be, not harmful, but it can be impacted is like you might be pulling data from 5,000 athletes, but they all could play in different systems, right? So their demands could be so much different from a midfielder to a defender to a forward. It could look completely, completely different. So what we did, especially in year one, was we collected. And at the end of year one, we said, okay, what were our positional demands and distance, high speed running, player load, all of it. So we were able to see, okay, on average, our defenders are going to have this much distance, this much high speed running, etc. So that when we go into year two, we know exactly what they need to be training for and things like that. Because we ran different systems, at our time at Mississippi State, and we found that like in different systems, sometimes defenders were the highest across the year, sometimes forwards were. Like it all depends on the playing style and what you're trying to do. So we use those numbers that way. That's just one way. And then, we look into thresholds and things like that when it comes to the matches. You're looking at an individual player's highest first halves, highest second half, almost like a worst case scenario. And then having those thresholds set within the game to where, it's green, then yellow, then red. It can help a lot of subbing decisions because it comes down to if you look at two players, you're thinking about subbing off the field, and one player is already up closer to their max. Maybe they get the breather coming out of the first half and then going into the second. Those are just a couple of.
How much change did you see when, to use your term, you kind of changed the strategy or the formation going into a match that way? Like in my mind, I'm picturing we used to run it was a 3-5-2, but I
Mhm.
always preferred on our travel club, we did a 4-4-2 with a diamond midfield. And I always loved the diamond midfield. But obviously, as you mentioned, coaches are going to try different things. They're going to change things, whether it's a new team or whether it's a different strategy to try and beat a team that's kind of been difficult to get by in the past that way. How much of a difference do you see match to match based on literally just changing the formation and maybe specifically where someone is on the pitch that way?
Generally across my time with soccer, generally a couple things that have stood out to me is that the midfielders are always going to be your engines in terms of distance. They're always going to have to run. That's a given, right? From the four back to a three back, you'll see the load for your defenders go up just because they're losing a fourth person in the back typically. And then, it's interesting enough, when we went to more of a counter pressing model, and went, more two front versus one front, from a forward standpoint, their load actually went up significantly because of our high press and counter pressing demands. But then it also took, 5 to 10% off of the middle of the field and the back line of the field. So those are just some small intricacies that we've noticed. And that's not even a formation thing. That's just literally the way you play and how that impacts it across the game.
I was literally going to be my next question is say formation doesn't change, but you're playing a different level of competition, right? Like maybe you're a 10th ranked team and one game is unranked opponent, out of conference and you sweep the floor with them 3-0, 4-0 kind of game. And the next one is one of those nail biters that goes down to the wire that way. Could go either way. How much of a difference do you see when, competition level is very, very high versus competition level from a complexity of game standpoint is a little bit lower?
Yeah, I mean, that's where yeah, I mean, it is just so game dependent, right? Typically the more you possess the ball, things like that, you're gonna have to run less, which is awesome. So if you have a team that's really just sitting in and letting you have the ball, you're probably gonna run less. It's gonna be harder to score because they're so compact in the middle, but overall, rather than a transitional game is when you see the load really ramp up when neither team can really get their structure, their shape kind of set in place because everything's just so back and forth. Those are where you see the loads really start to jump up, and you see that a lot in the SEC. You see it a lot, going deep into the NCAA's. It always shows up. So it's just really understanding beforehand what type of game you foresee it going to be, and that's where a lot of the data analytics comes into it as well. And that's just what we're starting to scratch right now in terms of some of that stuff. But really, it can really impact your periodization leading up to a match if obviously you can never predict a game, but if you have an idea of what it could look like based on data, based on if you played this team before, right, the style of game, it can really impact and change some things leading into your preparation.
Well, I think you're spot on with that. And as you mentioned, it's always game by game dependent. And one of the things that always amazes me is how even when you roll into a game thinking we've got this on lock, they haven't
Mhm.
been playing well, whatever it is, you never know when someone is going to go off and have the game of their life. and all of a sudden the easy game became a very difficult game. Or by the same token, you could also have people that just have a bad day, right? I was talking with a friend who, the team that he was with, their goalkeeper had a poor day the one day. You let up a lot of goals in a short amount of time, which hopefully doesn't happen in soccer. But if it does, it's like, hey, we kind of got to play the cards we're dealt now. So things can change at a moment's notice, regardless of how well you plan and how well you prepare.
I mean, that's why you don't really approach it in that way. Right now it's so much of a lot of our in-season load management comes down to acute to chronic ratios. Where are the players at individually? Obviously, the ones that are playing a lot are going to have probably higher values in that metric. But also that's where your in-season structure comes into play, right? 2 days out is probably going to be a higher day. One day out is going to be your match day -1, lower intensity. So that's where the structure kind of almost runs itself, but you use your data to help support those individual decisions, whether it's acute to chronic. We have the ability to see what is our weekly progression as a team and player. So, I think I heard one of your previous guests talk about it in season. It's really hard to say that, this player is only going to increase their load by 10%, right? Sometimes it's going to be 30%, sometimes it's going to be 40. But what does that mean? We're not pulling them from training because of that. But, in season, maybe we give them 2 less reps of this drill in practice, things like that. So that's where it can really start to become a practical tool for coaches in season.
How do the players go about accepting that? Because I'd imagine some of them take that very well. Like, hey, they're concerned about my well being and longevity in the sport and so on that way. And others might not take it the right way. Even though you have good intentions, they're going to look at it like, why am I not in this drill? Why am I not out there right now? Why am I being told to rest?
Right. It's a lot of education, when it comes to that, especially in season, right? It's obviously easier when a player's been through it once or, they've been through it before. They know how the long season feels, especially when you're trying to play deep into November, December. But yeah, for newer players, it's really just the education and the trust piece in terms of, hey, like we are looking at data not just on this iPad, but with the wellness questionnaires, with your sleep, with your this, we're looking 2 or 3 games ahead, right? In my role, part of my job is to look really, really far ahead in terms of what's coming from a load perspective. How many matches do we have in the next 3 weeks? Things like that. So when when the players really see the holistic view, I think they are a lot more bought into that. And, for us, it's never about, we're going to take you out of entire practice, but hey, let's get you off for 2 or 3 reps. Then you can go back in. But, we'll have very individual goals for those players. And then we'll try to structure the drills and the training in a way that where they're not just in for the first half and out for the second half. Maybe they're in for 2 reps, out for 2 reps, things like that. So that's kind of the way we approach it.
I love that. I love that. And as you mentioned, there's that holistic influence. It is certainly way more than just the numbers on the spreadsheet. You have to integrate what I would call the subjective with the objective, right? And depending on the person that you're working with, I like to say a lot of my assessments. Now, this is very different than sports science. This is physical therapy that I'm referring to here. I want to make that clear, but I'd say 80% of it is subjective sometimes, right? It's what are they telling me? What are they feeling? And some of these more self report oriented things. How do you put that together with what you see from a GPS and objective side of things? Because I found sometimes the two go hand in hand together almost in harmony, and other times they could not be more opposite. And you've got someone who crushes it, high workload, very high speeds, and yet you ask them how they're doing, and they're like, "Oh, I'm doing terrible," and all these different things. Like it's just so fascinating to me how the two go hand in hand sometimes, and sometimes they could not be further from each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's an art. It's an art and a science we're still trying to master, right? I think what's been helpful is not only pulling up the wellness report every single day and looking at those metrics, but also the simple question of how do you feel? Because right when I see a player in the morning and I ask her how she feels, and the answer is, I feel all right. I feel okay. And I saw her, on wellness, it was a 7 or an 8. I can start to think about, okay, when she says she's at a 7 or 8, this is what she's actually feeling, right? And it's just those small communication pieces in all areas, whether it's soreness, whether it's just overall energy levels, things like that. And then knowing the GPS numbers and norms for those players. So, like, if we're trying to limit a player going into a match, you might see that they're at the very top of the team ranking in distance that day, but that might not necessarily be a red flag because they might always be at the top. So it's like, what is it in relation to their norm is the bigger question for us. So it's balancing that the subjective, what they're putting, or the objective with what they're putting in the wellness, trying to figure out on a daily basis what that actually looks like to them. Because the scale of 1 to 10, everybody interprets it differently, right? You can have the scale saying one's easiest, 10's the hardest, but everybody interprets it differently. So it's actually diving into those relationships a little bit more to figure out what that looks like.
And building off of that for a second, I think a lot of times when we're talking about the science and analytics side of this, as we have been, a lot of times people also forget about some of the other components of this. Like they're not just athletes. A lot of times they're university students taking classes, having a life, all that sort of thing, which we've hit on a little bit. But I'm curious from an actual workload standpoint, how much does that influence your decisions and your breakdowns that way? You know, if someone refuses to use the scooter gifted by the university and they're going 25,000 steps a day outside of practice, outside of soccer and so on that way versus someone who maybe is doing everything to a T, you know, they use their scooter, they're staying off their feet, they're always in the recovery room, all these different things. And maybe they're 10 to 12,000 steps a day, which is still a lot, but more manageable than someone who's 25K plus, right? Like, how much do these out of practice workload type influences actually matter? I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely do. And I think it really comes down to what we talked about before, just the relationships and the trust piece in terms of, you know, for that day, right? Say you have two players, one gets 25,000 extra steps, one rides the scooter, but they both have the same goal to, you know, really push on a high intensity day. The idea is that if you're looking at it from a periodization standpoint, you're trying to figure out, what do they need as they're going through the session. Maybe it's that person. If you're trying to decide between the two, which one stays in the drill a little bit longer, you just give that extra rep or two to the person that rides the scooter, right? I know that's a really simple kind of example, but those are kind of the things we look at in terms of what is going on off the field, what is going on the field, and how can we make those small adjustments in training to factor that in. And sometimes, to be honest, you won't have the capability to factor it in because of what the day looks like and things like that. But it's always in the back of your head, and that's where it just helps to really understand the players and understand the team as a whole.
And we kind of touched on it a little bit already, but as we were talking about that holistic view, you had referenced sleep a couple times, and obviously nutrition is always discussed, especially in relation to the female athlete that way. What does that multidisciplinary collaboration look like for you all? Taking the science and analytics and self-report data and all these things that you get, and then kind of combining that into a framework that also accounts for some of these other areas that are discussed a lot, but sometimes difficult to intervene with, I guess I'll say.
So what's really helpful for us is that we have all of our data centralized, in an athlete monitoring system. So, it's all the coaches on staff, all the sports med personnel on staff have the ability to go in and look at a daily GPS report. They have the ability to go and look at a daily wellness, things like that. So even things that I can't necessarily or I don't point out, another coach might come in, like our strength and conditioning coach, Coach Kalen Kite might come in and look at, I saw this player was really, really high in soreness or things like that. And then that conversation is, that goes with our performance team, sports med, dietitian, things like that, to talk about those little one-off instances. But what we do is since we have so much at the end of every training day or going into the next one, we pretty much put a session map together of what all strength and conditioning is going to be included in the next morning, what the practice is going to look like in the next morning, and then with that, we include, okay, what was our total wellness at? Where are our most sore areas? What was our average sleep score? What was our average recovery score? And all the coaches get that information. And once again, it might not mean we tear apart the entire practice plan because our recovery was in the red. But it may mean if we see, higher soreness in our quads reported, maybe we pull off of finishing a little bit. Maybe we change our crossing into the box into just more general passing, right? Things like that is how we take what we're doing with the wellness things and the whoop and all that type of technology and put it into a way that's practical but not overwhelming for the staff.
And to your point, going back to what we talked about before, it always comes back to what modifications can we make from a soccer standpoint? Because at the end of the day, soccer is the main thing, right? That's
Right.
why they're here. And this is probably a hot take, but what they do in the weight room is important, but no one cares how much you squat if you're not available on game day.
Right.
And if you're not playing at the level you need to be playing in the soccer match, right? Like the weight room or, any other aspect of this cannot outweigh what you do on the pitch at the end of the day. So I love the concept of what can we modify from that allows us to continue to push forward.
And I think just going off of that a little bit, right? I think it's important that, especially in the sports science space, is, we always have a reporting system and we always want to communicate to the coaches what is going on at practice and what needs to be focused on going forward from a load standpoint. But I think always pairing the data that we're seeing with a practical takeaway, even if it's like two data points. But okay, what do we do with those data points now? Because that's what the coaches are going to really benefit from. I mean, we love the numbers in terms of, and the numbers really make a lot of sense to us, but they don't always make a lot of sense to other coaches. So, the more we can pair the data point with, okay, because of this, we should do this, or things like that. It really just helps the communication piece and makes the holistic training plan more effective going forward.
I think you're spot on with that. This is probably a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I want to bring it up just out of curiosity that way. How much fluctuation do you notice when times change on things, whether it's practice times change or game times are different than normal, or maybe there's some travel involved for the game. It's like, hey, we're going to go from Florida to California and play a soccer game for whatever reason, right? Like, how much do some of these other, like, kind of timing factors and variables, if you will, impact things?
I mean, there's there's so much to that in terms of, which variables have the most impact. Luckily we're in the SEC. We don't have to take too many cross country trips, which is fantastic. I hope that stays the same, but you never know nowadays. But I will say, the biggest things we look at is early kickoffs versus late kickoffs, mainly because if you have a late kickoff, if you're on the road, at least you're going to have a lot more time in the hotel. So what does that look like from a fatigue standpoint? Are you adding in additional almost like activation sessions throughout the day to keep athletes engaged and locked on? When it comes to early games, sometimes athletes perform better if they take care of their sleep because everything is just go, go, go. You eat breakfast at 8 a.m., you do your jog and stretch at 9, you do your taping and all that, and then you're pretty much to the field for warm up. So sometimes that response is a lot better than when it's the late kickoff. And then also looking at the early versus late, just obviously the temperatures and things like that. Obviously, in the South, it gets really hot in the early time around 1 or 2 o'clock where these games usually take place. And then when you're late into the afternoon, what does that change from a hydration standpoint, a fueling standpoint? How many pregame, different meals and things can you add in just to make sure athletes are on top of it? But once again, that's where it comes to looking ahead at your schedule and seeing what those things are. And if you have opportunities, number one, to test those out in the spring, absolutely test different things. But the spring should almost be like a dry run in terms of your structure for pregame activities. Factor in the travel, try to do the same consistent travel, consistent pregame, to really help athletes. Once we get to fall, it's not a shock once we start doing some of these things.
Using that spring as a trial run, if you will, in my opinion, I think it's getting easier and easier because now there's games in the spring. Right?
Right.
It's like you can actually simulate a match day out of season per se, which maybe I'm dating myself here, but back when I was in college, they maybe did a scrimmage or two in the spring, and that was it. It was mostly training or practice time or whatever that way. So I think that's huge. And another potential rabbit hole, but a lot of soccer teams that I've talked with and worked with in the past, they do international trips. And a lot of the colleges are doing them right before their season kicks off, right? It's, hey, we're going to get the whole team together. We're going to Europe on a 10-day training trip, if you will, which maybe there's some games, maybe there's some practice, a lot of
Right.
sightseeing. There's a lot of new associated with that. Have you been a part of anything like that in the past? And if so, what changes do you see when we factor in international travel? Because at least from my opinion of what I'd expect to see, I'd expect sleep to be shot to bits and strain levels to be through the roof and HRV to be all over the place, if nothing else.
I mean, I'll start. We did a international trip to London with Mississippi State, I think back in 2024. Yeah, so we went over there during spring break. So it was convenient that it was in the spring and not leading into the fall. But there was a lot to learn from that experience. Number one, the absolutely take advantage of the international trip when you can get it, right? The ability to sightsee, the ability to go to different, European Premier League clubs is really, really awesome and, absolutely worth taking advantage of. But, the things that we saw in that experience was, when you weren't playing a game, you were touring. So athletes were putting on thousands and thousands of steps throughout the day. Obviously, you went later into the evening, so sleep probably was, hindered a little bit. But I mean, when we were there, if I remember correctly, we didn't even practice. We literally just played 3 games throughout the course of a week and then intermix that with different professional matches, touring, things like that. So overall, it's an awesome experience. It does, from a athletic development or physical development standpoint, you can get behind a little bit only because you're not able to lift, you're not able to do things that you normally do over that spring break time. But you are playing a lot, so you're checking the fitness box at least. And then it's just really managing fatigue coming back from that, right? So just making sure that when you get back from those trips, there's adequate recovery time, additional recovery protocols, things like that are really helpful coming off the back end of those.
When you are in those worst case scenarios that way where, hey, we can't get in the weight room, we can't practice, all that sort of thing, has there been anything looking back, especially at your time at state, that maybe shift to a microdose model or, hey, we're going to do like manual resisted stuff, or we're going to just smoke Copenhagen's and partner Nordics or something like that? Has there been anything that you found really works well from those kind of like worst case scenarios where it's like, hey, match day volume is high, practice volume is non-existent. We want to get some stimulus in. Where do we go?
I mean, there's always room for those sorts of interventions during, activation sessions. We would always do one no matter where the game was in the morning leading into it. Um, you know, but if you're looking to do things like med ball throws and things like that, obviously you're not going to take that with you on the road. So just being intentional with, low volume plyos, whether it's short distance sprints, things like that, or some of those strength exercises like you talked about, Copenhagen and Nordics can be good ones too. It's just we haven't done it. We haven't been in so many scenarios where we haven't had, access for long periods of time. One of my favorite experiences is we actually were in, I think we are playing Arizona State and we actually went to, like, this garage gym with our low minute players, man. It was insane. It was like a bodybuilding garage gym. I wish I could remember the name of it, but in the middle of Tempe, Arizona. And, I mean, yeah, we just got after it in one of our match day plus ones. We didn't even go to the field, just took the low minute players to the garage gym and let it rip, man. So there's different ways to get creative with it, whether it's, finding different facilities or just kind of working and then something at the hotel. We've done like hotel open hours, things like that, where we give the athlete a plan and they kind of go in and do it on their own. So a lot of different ways you can work that in.
I love that. I love that. I realize people listening might be thinking, man, Victor has a cool freaking job. How the heck do I get into this? Right. Especially with this rise of sports science and performance focused and analytics and so on that way. How do you recommend people get to maybe a similar position as you with the team in the future?
Yeah, I think for with like what you talked about, the rise in analytics, the rise in data, with the use of AI nowadays, data is becoming so prevalent in our game, whether it's physical performance data, whether it's tactical data, things like that. And teams are wanting to use it at the highest levels. But I think the ultimate key to get a role similar to like the one I have, or to be really successful in the sports science realm, is to not only know the numbers, but know the practical application. Like when you're looking at different GPS loads, different trends, like really analyze it. I think I got so much experience in, analysis, just doing our daily practice reports for 3 years straight. That's hundreds and hundreds of times where, it's not just setting numbers, but why were the numbers this way? When you see jump trends, why do you think they're doing that? If we change this, what does it look like? Really just ask yourself a lot of questions as you move through the sports science realm, because once again, you need the foundational, you need the data experience. You need to have that ability to really dive into that stuff and understand the numbers. But the more you can start to understand how a coach can use it immediately, you're going to become so much more valuable within a team or organization.
I love that concept of asking why and digging deeper. And as we mentioned before, with the rise of AI usage, there's certain things that you probably don't need to memorize anymore. You probably don't need to memorize the formula for your favorite statistics equation anymore. Like you
Right.
can just access it so much easier than you ever could in the past, right? Or if nothing else, like you can integrate an AI and build a calculator specifically to do that for you, right? It takes a few minutes at most. But to your point, AI cannot give you the context. And if you're using it for context like that, in my opinion, it's too random and sporadic and it's not reliable enough. Yes, it has a very deep level of knowledge, but you never know what you're going to get out of it. And I think as a person being able to analyze other people and doing it over and over and over again, you get better and better and better at it. And I think this is one thing, and I could be wrong about this, but as of right now, I'm standing on that hill. I don't think AI can fully replace this. I think it can help streamline things, especially in relation to creating an initial dashboard, but I don't think it can replace the actual judgment because a lot of the times these decisions that we're making are very gray and require multiple people's input. When AI, typically, from my understanding, is going to look at it black or white and it's going to make a decision on its own.
And I actually have some fun with this. I actually test AI to see if it can take my job yet, and usually I'm not convinced. So a lot of time we'll plug in different tactical or something scenarios in terms of what would you do in this scenario, AI? What would you do in this scenario from a load standpoint? And it just once again it reads off something very black and white, something very concrete with no flexibility, right? There's going to be flexibility in all the decisions that we make. Um, and that's where knowing what the underlining, problems or things going on within the data is more and more important going forward in this day and age.
I completely agree. Victor, I realize we can probably chat about this all day long. Is there anything we missed or didn't cover that maybe we should have today?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot. There's nothing really that comes to mind for me right now.
Victor, for people who want to find out more about you and keep up to date with all the incredible stuff you're doing in the soccer space, where can they find you at online and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty active on Instagram and Twitter as well, LinkedIn, common places. Absolutely love connecting with people in the space that are trying to, grow within the profession or, really maximize this profession. We're always trying to stretch the standards in that regard. So I'm always, love talking to people, things like that. Absolutely feel free to reach out. And really appreciate you having me on to kind of, just talk shop a little bit.
Yeah, we'll drop all of that in the description below too. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and find Victor all over the place online. This was incredible. Really appreciate your time and everything you're doing, Victor.
Appreciate it, man.